Hello and welcome to our review of 2021. Uh, it is perhaps unusual for an organization such as Digital Futures that has the term futures in its name to look back on the past, but to my mind it's important to look back at the successes, look back at what we've achieved in one year in order to build upon it for the future. Let me start by thanking all those involved. That means our team that has been promoting, supporting this, all of them, all of whom are volunteers who do it out of their love of architecture and in order to make the world a better place. I'd like to thank also those who contributed to our various events, the workshop instructors, those who took part in the sessions, who made it all possible. And above all, I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for being part of this very innovative project. 2021 was a very important year for Digital Futures. By far the most important event, of course, was the Inclusive Futures event over the summer, the largest ever of such event that we've hosted in the past. A key theme, of course, was the theme of inclusivity itself. What we're trying to do with Digital Futures is, in a sense, to democratize education by bringing important educational ideas to people throughout the world, regardless of where they are and who they come from, trying to transcend all differences in terms of either gender, religion, ethnicity, age, or economic standing. To our mind, important educational ideas should be available for everyone throughout the world as a human right. And it was this theme of inclusivity that was infused throughout our summer event. It meant, for example, that we held a special workshop on inclusivity. And above all, the most important thing for me was that we managed to host workshops in a series of different languages, not just English and Chinese, but also Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Farsi, Russian, Turkish, and so on. And this is an important development that we're building upon in the future. Just this coming week, we're going to have our first ever session in Arabic. That's going to be an amazing development for us, shortly followed by our first ever session in Farsi. And then in the beginning of 2022, we'll be hosting our first session in Spanish and be following that up by Portuguese and Russian. This, to my mind, is a huge development in terms of the future of Digital Futures. Another key development over the summer was the inauguration or the establishment of the Doctoral Consortium, initially called the Digital Consortium. And this was really intended as a way to open up education for doctoral students and would-be doctoral students across the globe. It didn't make any sense anymore for individual professors and individual classrooms to talking just simply to a small group of students when we could use a single platform to bring the most important ideas from the best professors in the world to everyone throughout the world. The idea of the Doctoral Consortium is as an inclusive platform, not as an exclusive space, not as a kind of Ivy League, shall we say, for doctoral education, but rather as an inclusive platform that's available for everyone around the world. And importantly also, it's there to leave a repository of videos, of recordings of these sessions, recordings for the future of architects and students as a resource available for free. We kicked it off with an incredible lecture by Slavoj Žižek, probably the leading intellectual in the world, certainly one of the most inspiring philosophers that I've come across. And we followed it up with a series of other events that included some of the leading architects and philosophers in the world and architectural designers. We had a series of them over the summer: architecture and philosophy, performative design, computational design, a hitchhiker's guide to artificial intelligence, and we're following those up with more sessions. This last semester, we've had an extension of the architecture and philosophy session with another series sponsored by the DDES at FIU that continues the tradition that was established by Tongji. And I'd like to thank Philippe, my colleague in Tongji, for helping to host these sessions and for setting up this initiative, which I think will transform education worldwide. Another important development over the summer was the inclusion of some awards for inclusivity itself. and we gave a series of awards, and some of these will be featured in this particular session. I just want to mention one particular new award, which was made in memory of Mark Cousins, who tragically died this year, but who was one of the greatest figures in architectural theory around the world. He was one of the most charismatic people, one of the most generous individuals, who was very keen to share his ideas with others and very much embodied the spirit of digital futures, even though he wasn't necessarily interested in computation itself. Nonetheless, on a Friday, typically at the Architectural Association in Bedford Square in London, they would open their doors to these incredible lectures that he would give, mesmerizing, charismatic lectures, open to everyone for free throughout London. This, I think, the development of a theory award is an important part of what we're doing in opening things up beyond just simply the technology itself towards the theoretical concerns, and also issues such as environmental sustainability and so on. To my mind, we've had an incredible year in 2021, but the highlight was, I'm sure, was, to my mind anyway, was the award for InclusiveFUTURES award to Deep Himmelblau, to Corp Himmelblau for their project Deep Himmelblau, a project which, to my mind, is the leading AI-based project in architecture so far. It was masterminded by Daniel Bolojan, who's part of our team, and makes a fitting start with which to launch our review of 2021. Wolf Bricks, Deep Himmelblau.
First, I have to say, without Daniel, we never would have got so far like we are right now. This is a major thing for me, but while I'm collecting all these things together, and I did a lecture about decon and IA, I found out that we always, since '68 when we founded Himmelblau, we always went for coincidences and mistakes in the method of thinking architecture. Because the driving point was, we always said, if you only think in architectural terms, only architecture will come out, and nothing more is boring than architecture. We said 1968. So while working on to translate drawings into models and models into reality, and sketching with a lighter, yeah, which turns out it was the first idea of this blazing wing. Working with materials we can bend and with the lighter as well. PVC foil, we created new shapes we called form mutations. This is one thing. The other thing is we started to think about how can we change architecture radically. And we found out that we have to find the weakest point in the process of developing projects. And we found out, or we think this is the moment of designing. And by shorten this moment and excluding all the constraints which prohibits to liberate the space we are thinking of, we think this is the way we can we can find new shapes and forms in our architectural language. And we experimented a lot, and this key project was the so-called open house, where I made the sketch with eyes closed, using my hand and my brain as a seismograph of the feelings you will have when you step into the space we are designing. So this is a short background of our way. And when I looked at the Deep Himmelblau movies, I thought, okay, this is almost that what we always wanted to do. I personally had no idea how I can do it, and thanks God we had Daniel in our office who started to work on it with two of our Viennese guys now, and we are still developing the whole thing. So we have three, let's say three co-workers. AI1, this is the co-worker who is concerned with shapes and gestalt, forms. A2 will be the guy who is learning our ground plans, our sections, and the co-worker AI3 is the co-worker who is responsible for BIM, Building Information Modeling. Because my thinking is, and the schools have to experiment on this thing as well, my thinking is, when we will get in 10 years commission to do, let's say, an opera, and the client says, I need an auditorium for 2,000 and the rehearsal auditorium and things like that, we just programming this wish of the client. Then our office goes in a bar and celebrates. After 2 days, we come back and the whole thing is finished. Then we are working on the model, a 3D model, the physical model, changing it a little bit. Then we are going back into deep Himmelblau, the co-worker 1 and 2, and then we give an order to our co-worker 3, the BIM, he should make all the plans. And we write on our honorarium to the client. When the money is in, we are going on to the Maldives and have holidays for 2 months. Because everything is done by a machine. That is my dream. I don't have to work anymore. I just decide on the shape and form a little bit, but the logic thing is done by the 2 other co-workers called 3 other co-workers, A1, A2, and A3. This is how we started Himmelblau in '68. And we said we had a very complicated name. Himmelblau means sky blue. If you erase the L from Himmelblau, then the meaning changes from the sky blue into building the sky. And we always wanted to build our project. And we said we wanted to build clouds, which are architecture, which is changing like clouds. And this was our dream when we started. And now maybe it's possible. It takes another 10 years maybe, and then it's okay. And on the other side, when we started to promote buildings which were built by robots, everyone said, oh, you will make all the workers on the building site hungry, they will be fired. And we wanted to make a study what we can do with these workers on the site when robots are taking over. But no one understood what we are talking about. And I think Europe will be behind the times when the Chinese are coming to Europe and build all the buildings with robots. And this will happen very soon. Yeah, I like this. I like buildings which could change and will be buoyant like clouds. This is a comparison of the building industry and the architect. My friend, this brain researcher, Wolf Singer, he's very famous in Europe and very, very far ahead of investigating our brain, how the brain is working. He compares this computer with the brain of a fly. And he said, that the fly can make decision in milliseconds in order to survive. The computer, if he could dream, he will dream that he could be so fast like the brain of the fly. And I compared this picture with the situation of the building industry and the architect. The building industry is the most stupid and slow industry you can imagine. And we architects are very flexible and very, very fast in inventing new things. But we, how I said, the building culture is behind. Drawing, making drawings. I always depend on drawings and other things in order to try to integrate mistakes and errors and coincidences in our work, because coincidences are the trigger point of a forthcoming evolution. I'm not drawing anymore with the pen or with the with the pen. I'm drawing on the computer in the 3D things, and this is what's going to happen. Sooner or later, I will be able to draw in the third dimension as well. We are working on this program. And of course, this is just for the home office, because I'm depending always on models, on built things. So we communicate if I'm staying at home or far away via this avatar meeting room where we can discuss the three-dimensional project. Yeah, this is Daniel's interpretation of the Himmelblau universe. And what's interesting is that you can see on the left side that there are images which doesn't belong to architectural ideas. They came from other levels. Nevertheless, we will integrate it if the AI has learned how to deal with our forms and shapes. Yeah, get closer and closer. He learned already almost all our projects. And now we can start to work on the shape and gestalt of the project. What I'm missing in all these things, I like that, because this is the end of Corbusier, namely to define joints. Everything is floating into each other. And this is a very remarkable next step in architecture. I don't know how the industry will work on that, but we are designing already materials which going into each other with no joints, which is almost impossible to build in this stupid with this stupid building industry. Yeah? But this is how the computer learned to use our things. So the next step is AI2, where we integrate all our plans and sections so that we can follow up not only creating new shapes, but also creating new ground plans, sections, and details. This is the next step and a very important step. Otherwise, we are only in, this is our procedure, how we work on projects in our office right now. For instance, this is only this on the left side, the camera input is organized by hand, so to say, an organized building. Plans and sections are done, and we did a model and let the AI play with the shape so that we can maybe use some of the ideas into to bring this model into reality. What I like on this movie is the colors are really crazy and reminded me not only because of the color, also because of the shape on the building of, on the painting of Francis Bacon, which is one of my favorite painter. It could be done by the AI as well, but I don't know whether it will touch this emotional level this painting shows up when you can see it. Also, it's a project coming up in Russia on the Crimea. It's a harbor with a conference center. And this is what I like, using our shapes, meshing it together in a very irrational way, and a building will come out sooner or later. So, but since we are building always models, and this is our studio right now, but maybe in 10 years, it will look like that. The guys sitting here will be with me on the Maldives on holiday because AI is doing all our work. Yeah, clouds. And thank you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Virginia Melnick, one of the organizers here at Digital Futures for the past few years. I'm here to tell you about my favorite video from the past year, which has really seen so much growth as we've hosted events almost every Saturday, live streaming on YouTube and Bilibili, as well as the expansion of our summer workshops, which really began to address workshops in multiple languages and reach to all sorts of different corners of the world. My favorite video from this year was from Felecia Davis, who is an architect and designer researching textiles and materials and how our bodies interact with them in space and the environment. I really liked her project at the flower antenna at MoMA that was installed this past March. And this project we actually gave a Digital Futures Project Award to for its beautiful design and its cultural importance. So please enjoy this video replay of Felecia Davis's lecture from our spring panel on soft materials here at Digital Futures. Thank you. But Felecia is a computational textile designer who reimagines how we might use textiles in our daily lives and within architecture. She has integrated smart elements such as sensors and receptors into her materials so that she can engage humans and interact with them. She is interested in developing computational methods in relation to design specific bodies and specific places, engaging specific social and cultural political constructs. She is an associate professor at the Stuckman Center for Design Computing in the School of Architecture at Penn State University and director of Soft Lab PSU. She completed her PhD in design computation at MIT, and her work engages art, science, and engineering. Currently, she has her work exhibited at MoMA in the Reconstruction, Blackness, and Architecture in America. And she is also a founding member of Black Reconstruction Collective a not-for-profit group of Black architects, scholars, and artists supporting design work about the Black diaspora. Welcome, Felecia.
Thank you, Virginia. Can everyone see my screen without the presenter notes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it's always fun to have happen. Thank you so much for this opportunity and invitation to have this conversation with these amazing folks. So I'm really looking forward to today. So in this slide presentation, I'd like to share with you a capsule of some ideas that are part of the work that was done for the Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, which, as Virginia mentioned, is on exhibit until the 31st of May in New York. I would like to show you some of the entanglements, so to speak, of working with textiles, computation, and soft materials. I find that the material itself shapes a way of thinking and working that I think leads to considering architecture and its practices in a different way. So I would say that my lab has been working towards understanding a soft system, which is thus far to us a system that accounts for and accommodates a technological series of methods that can register design in relationship to specific bodies in particular places and their kind of social construction. I don't think we have that kind of quest like where we want it to be yet, but we are striving and we're looking for how to get there. And so I would love to have this discussion to push that further along. In my lab, Soft Lab at Penn State in the Stookman Center for Design Computing, we work on computational textiles, which are textiles that respond to their environment via programming, embedded sensors, and electronics. In addition, we look at the responses from the natural properties of fibers, where the response is used by the designer to communicate some type of information. So communication for our purposes means the sending of an intentional message or information through an aesthetic expression. So our work in the lab is really to relook at the role of textiles in building, not just as a way to achieve lightweight buildings, but to understand how we can use the fibers of the textile itself to communicate and how that impacts the larger architecture. So I'd like to have a look at what I mean by computational textiles as a material. If you really start to think about it, computational textiles change the idea of material. Material may be seen like in the above image, where a designer is weaving together a person, a body monitor, such as a heart monitor, a mobile phone, a laptop, a set of responsive yarns, a power system, and the larger environment. So this particular drawing shows one example of a material textile system, but there may be other systems that include other parts, such as a person who may be looking at what's happening to the heart monitor, or a manufacturer who may be connected with a wearer. So to our eyes, a smart material or materials have really included bodies that is done in a way that's very expansive. So if one could look at this, one might ask, thinking back to Semper, what style of material do we have here? What kind of skills, tools, resources are needed here to create such materials? And how should we classify them? If materials change us as we change them, as Tim Ingold and J.J. Gibson's and many others argue, how are these materials changing our bodies and our way of thinking? And maybe we can return to some of these questions later in our discussion. So the work of the studio that was done for the show at MoMA is titled Fabricating Networks, transmissions and receptions from the Hill District. And it used computational textiles, which look at the idea of networking or connecting with people. In this case, connecting with the residents of a historically Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh. It was that social and emotional connection that was of most concern to us, and the means by which that could happen. Unfortunately, COVID intervened and stopped our in-person quilting sessions, but we're looking forward to working on telling the story of the Hill District and residents when things start to open back up. But there are two parts to this work, transmissions and receptions. The transmissions part connects the stories of the Hill District in Pittsburgh. The quilt points to those experiences and skills with sewing, working with soft materials, and brings them into architecture as real material, as metaphor, or as heuristic device for thinking about operations and concepts in making and architecture. The quilt operates as a way to start a conversation about making and as a repository of history. When touched, the copper in each panel activates a speaker that tells a story of what happened in that panel. And as I said, we plan on taking this quilt on the road to the Hill District to hear other stories. So here, the softness in this material system is how we define the concept of construction of communication, which is collaborative and incrementally built. The lily pad, which you see in the bottom of the picture, is designed by Leah Beakley, a designer and computer scientist at the University of New Mexico, and it permits the fashioning of do-it-yourself work. This is supported by a network of online tutorials and programs. This network is also part of what we understand to be the material. For many of the works we do, the ability to access and use these inexpensive do-it-yourself components is what the difference is between soft and hard, a soft boundary and a hard boundary. So here's a detail of that quilt showing a scene that speaks to how I set up my lab at Penn State. The lab at Penn State is a way of foregrounding the making experiences that many of us had as kids and still have working with soft materials. These materials call for another way of fabrication and thinking about architecture that connects both the scale of the body, because we often start by making things like clothing and then move up to very large scales of architecture. Working this way also returns you to the specifics of your body, not some abstract body that you're building for, but a particular body. And for this direction, there are two research kind of prongs, or I guess you could say areas in the lab. The first direction is more architecturally traditional, where we look at using textiles for sheltering. These are projects like tents, shade structures, etc. A second direction is looking at the human body in space and trying to understand the potentials for rethinking what architecture could be by understanding the augmented and sensing body in its environment. These projects are materials that you wear on your body or use the body as part of its system. A scene like you see in this quilt panel was a very familiar scene to me growing up. And I feel and still feel that many of the things that I've been thinking about came from this well of knowledge about soft materials. So the reception part of the project that's at MoMA is what we call the flower antenna, and is located in the museum. It's not on the road traveling, it's an installation. It's a symbolically responsive structure, a receiving antenna. 34 knitted, industrially knitted cones are embedded with pink copper yarns that transmit the presence of electromagnetic waves via high-pitched live sounds in the gallery. This black flower serves to make visible and present the workings of an invisible urbanism that floats above the physical city, supported and constructed by electromagnetic waves. These invisible waves are a new global ocean, making it possible for people to connect through the internet. However, traversing this ocean in our everyday practices is as perilous as the Atlantic or Middle Passage. The black flower is a reminder of this other invisible space that's also being constructed and needs attention for more life-valuing future. So the underbelly of the antenna shows pink copper embedded yarns, which is what permits the collection of the invisible electromagnetic waves in the gallery. This form of the flower was selected to give us the opportunity to study a gradient of parametrically sized cones. These were drawn in Kangaroo and Kiwi 3D, simulated to see if we could predict the sizes and shapes of the cones. So very much like Meti's practice and Yuli's practice, we are involved as architects in trying to predict what we draw from the digital representation and getting it into a fabricated piece. Because as you know, with textiles, what you start off with is often very different from what you end up with in terms of drawing to fabrication. So this was important to help with getting the fiberglass compression rods the right length and the right diameters. We also tested a couple different of machine learning methods and have looked at Meti's and Yuli's methods on this using scanning as well as a couple of other methods. And we're publishing part of this research, who is being done by Farzana Aghazian, a PhD student in the Soft Lab, titled A Simulation Process for Architectural Knitted Textiles at IAAS. So more on this will be published and you should look for that to follow up on that. So underneath, we're looking at this pink copper yarn, which was really a big help in terms of helping us predict and stabilize, predict the position and stabilize the cotton yarn that we were using. So not only were we trying to predict from the drawing, but also trying to understand the qualities of yarns and how that affected this issue of kind of getting from the drawing to the actual material. Oops, oh dear. Sorry about that. So this just gives you an idea of some of the scale of these cones. They were quite large. We were trying to really get our work from smaller sample pieces to larger pieces that we could begin to imagine people being within and circulating around. So to wrap things up about our lab, what we're really trying to do in developing these computational methods, tools, and designs for soft architectures is connect with people emotionally, to register their presence, to provoke questions about the order of our society. We view softness as a powerful quality to think about reconstructing. And so with that, I will conclude and look forward to the other presentations in our conversation. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you all for joining today. My name is Bhavleen Kaur, and I am an assistant professor at Balwanshi School of Architecture in Mumbai. Along with my teaching, I'm also the India Regional Manager at DigitalFUTURES. It is my pleasure today to discuss my thoughts on the selection for year-end highlights. The session on AI ethics, artificial intelligence, urbanism, ethics, and design brings together and put forward some very interesting ideas. The session moderated by Tom Barabes and Pablo Lorenzo talks about the socio-political and economic implications of AI-driven design. The presentations further on addresses critical consequences of artificial intelligence and also the role of human agency in a world of automated and intelligent systems. Another interesting question which is brought together in this part of the panel discussion is if AI algorithms are human-made, and it gets me thinking, to what extent do we share a stake of onus to the action of AI systems? I hope you equally enjoy the selection. Thank you all.
I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Behnaz Farahi, Assistant Professor, School of Cinematic Arts, University of Southern California, and Director of Farahi Architecture, Fashion, Interactive Design. Behnaz's lecture is called AI, Surveillance, and the Gaze. What does it mean to live in our digital culture, where our bodies are enmeshed in the materiality of machine algorithms, sensors, and digital processes? How could AI systems undermine the underlying unjust biases and serve to empower those who face injustice? This presentation addresses the notion of the gaze and surveillance in our contemporary digital media from social and political perspectives. Through the implementation of computer vision, biometric sensor technologies, and machine learning algorithms, this presentation examines how different strategies of the gaze can be seen to undermine various forms of power structure and to promote forms of resistance. It also explores how literal masks may hide or reveal new identities, and other strategies to marginalize groups to develop their own secret language. This presentation avoids technological determinism rather than rehashing arguments as whether surveillance is good or bad. It takes an intersectional critical feminist approach to illustrate what constitutes the gaze and surveillance and what might prove to be effective strategies of resistance in creative practices. Behnaz is trained as an architect. Farahi is an award-winning designer and critical maker based in LA. She holds a PhD in interdisciplinary media arts and practice from USC School of Cinematic Arts. Currently, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Design, California State University, Long Beach. Farahi explores how to foster an empathetic relationship between the human body and the space around it using computational systems. Her work addresses critical issues such as feminism, emotion, perception, and social interaction. She is the co-editor of the issue of AD, 3D Printed Body Architecture, 2017, and Interactive Futures, forthcoming. Thank you, Behnaz, for joining us, and please, we welcome you to our lectures and event series.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Tom and Marcelo, and all the organizers of these amazing events. I'm very happy to be here. With that, I'm going to share my screen. And hear the sound? Where we are immersed in the world of machine learning algorithms, computer vision, and biometric sensors. But what does this all mean? Might these computational systems not replicate, somewhat disturbingly, our underlying biases and serve to reinforce the marginalization of those who have typically been excluded? Is AI necessarily complicit in replicating human prejudice? Or are there ways of deploying AI as a means of exposing human bias? I would suggest that there are potential strategies that could be deployed for AI to actually overcome bias. In this presentation, I'm going to address notions of the gaze, surveillance, and ways of seeing through the lens of my own creative practice. By implementing computer vision technologies, I hope to examine how different strategies of the gaze can be seen to undermine various forms of power structure and to promote forms of resistance. Here I'm trying to avoid any form of technological determinism. Rather than rehashing arguments as to whether surveillance is good or bad, I hope to take an intersectional feminist approach to show what constitute the gaze and surveillance, and to consider what the strategies of resistance might be proved to be effective in art and design practices. In my work, I have used various computer vision technologies to enhance human perception. For example, this is an emotive wearable which can recognize and respond to the facial expressions of people around with different types of behaviors. This type of smart, soft robotic garment could potentially benefit those with autism who have difficulties recognizing facial expressions. Another work, Iridescence, is an emotive collar equipped with a facial tracking camera and an array of rotating quills, which respond to the movement of onlookers and their facial expressions. Similar to how a blind person could sense through haptic information, the movement of the wearable would allow the wearer to sense where people are standing and the emotions they're expressing, even with her eyes closed. To address two questions related to the notion of the gaze. Firstly, what does it mean to be observed? Secondly, what do we see when we look out at the world? Through my argument, I use gaze as an interchangeable concept which could be shared between human and machine. This takes us to the historical concept of panopticon. The panopticon refers to a type of institutional building and a system of control envisioned by English philosopher Jeremy Bentham in 18th century. The layout of the panopticon allows a guard to observe occupants without them knowing whether or not they're being watched. French philosopher Michel Foucault revitalizes interest in the panopticon in his 1975 book Discipline and Punish, and uses it to illustrate such a model could be applied to disciplinary societies in order to control their citizens. He described the prisoner of a panopticon as being at the receiving end of asymmetrical surveillance. As a consequence, the inmate polices himself for fear of punishment. What is fascinating about this example is that rather than external actions, the gaze of the watcher is internalized to such an extent that each prisoner becomes his or her own watch person. Similarly, we could argue that this is what allows rules and regulation to be internalized so as to inform our actions, behaviors, and even our beliefs. Moreover, the manner in which we naturalize and internalize rules, it could be claimed, causes society to be less willing to contest unjust laws and accept a dominant outlook. Similar to how the inmates are not aware whether or not they're being watched, we are not aware that we have been controlled through naturalized dominant rules rooted in our own culture. This internalized asymmetrical power structure could be seen in the notion of male gaze. In her essay on visual pleasure and narrative cinema, Laura Mulvey exposes the asymmetry of social and political power relations between men and women. Mulvey claims that the male gaze serves to depict women as the object of pleasure for the heterosexual male viewer. Besides the fact that women are regularly subject to sexual harassment whenever they enter public space through various forms of looked-atness, women have absorbed all this unconsciously as a form of internalized male gaze. What if women were to subvert this through the power of their gaze? Could we draw upon computer vision technologies to allow women to know when onlookers are staring at them? Augmented with facial and gaze tracking technology and smart materials, this cape responds to the onlooker's gaze. The project engages with broader social issues such as the male gaze on the female body. The facial tracking algorithm in this piece detects age, gender, and gaze of the onlooker. While we know that gender is performative and it doesn't depend on pure representation, the movement of the garment based on the viewer's gaze could unfold a new sets of social meanings. If you are the wearer, you know which part of your body is being looked at, and if you are an onlooker, you know that your action is being noticed. The aim is to see how different strategies could be used to undermine the patriarchal system by developing a form of resistance using surveillance technology. I wonder, what do we see as we gaze out to the world? As a thought experiment, French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan invites us to envision ourselves before a female mantis. The female mantis is known for devouring its partner after sex. In Lacan's experiments, we're wearing a mask, and we do not know whether the mask represents us as a female or male, and therefore we don't know whether or not we will be eaten by the female mantis. We simply do not know what we are to the other, and we often project our own very biases to the other in order to understand the other. In fact, we don't see anyone as they are, rather we see them as we are. And how we are is informed by the conformity to many of behavioral assumptions dictated by laws and customs. Although the colonial, racist, and sexist gaze might project oppression, backwardness, and terrorism onto the image of Muslim women wearing a burqa, I would like to stress the inherent difference between a mask and masquerade. While the mask hides, the masquerade reveals, but perhaps we could suggest that both are acting to some extent as a shield against the intrusive gaze. This project is inspired by the historical mask worn by Bandari women from southern Iran. It has been said that these masks were developed during Portuguese colonial rule as a way of protecting the wearer from the gaze of a slave master looking for pretty women. From these Iranian masks protecting women from the patriarchal oppression, to masks of Northwest Coast Indians, to masks worn as political statements, masks take on a range of different religious, social, and political roles. and offer an interesting insight into how we could use them to either conceal or reveal our identities. While these Iranian masks cover most of the wearer's face except the eye, I've been wondering how the eyes could be used as an expressive medium for communication. In my research, I came across an interesting incident in which an American officer uses blinking to send a secret message. In this video, you're seeing Admiral Jeremiah Denton blinking the word torture using Morse code during his captivity in Vietnam.
What's so-called definite law. Do you think that's present about?
Well, I don't know what is happening, but whatever the position of my government is, I support it fully. Well, whatever the position of my government is, I believe in it. Yes, sir. I am a member of that government.
The use of code for communication is nothing new, and in fact, women came up with a code word as a method for reporting domestic abuse during this lockdown. In this project, I was particularly inspired by a recent experiment involving 2 AI bots at the Facebook AI lab. The intention was to monitor how 2 bots might develop a dialogue. However, during this experiment, the bots seemingly started to formulate their own language, a language that no human could understand. The researchers had to intervene and tweak the algorithms to prevent this from happening. The story could also reveal how knowledge is power, and inability to understand unnerves those who wish to maintain their authority. For the source text of this project, I used the seminal article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, by the feminist theorist Gayatri Spivak. She asked whether it might be possible for the colonized, or the subaltern, to have a voice in the face of colonial oppression. Using machine learning algorithm, we can use Markov chain to create a text. We represent each word as a state and view transitions as the likelihood that a specific word might go after another. We can consider these states at either a word or character level, and we can analyze what the probability might be of a given letter appearing after 3 letters. The n-grams of a given text provides a strategy for generating the next text. The Markov chain could be therefore used to generate text where each new letter is dependent upon the previous letters. As the mask communicates using BLE protocol, the algorithm is repeated and the n-grams changes. The smaller the n-gram gets, the less meaning there is in the generated text from the linguistic perspective. Each letter generated through this process is translated into Morse code, which informs the movement of the actuators. In the video documentation of this project, which will be shown shortly, you will see 2 women wearing masks, covered with eyelashes controlled by AI. They begin to communicate with each other, blinking their eyelashes in rapid succession. The aim is to develop a secret message for transmitting information between multiple women. The project brings together design, critical thinking, feminism, and AI. Winston Churchill once said, "We shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us." But doesn't this suggest a form of technological determinism? After all, there is no inherent application for any tool. A knife could be used as a murder weapon or just as a tool for cutting an apple. Similar arguments could be made about surveillance. The question we should ask are, in what context, how, and for whom are we using it? We should be aware of potential problems with AI. For once an issue is recognized as problem, it becomes a different kind of problem. It becomes a problem not by which we are trapped, but rather with which we can deal. Bias is certainly a problem which originates from human beings and is replicated and even exacerbated in AI. As we are training the artificial algorithms to learn to see the world, it is important to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be seen by the machine? And through the lens of what kind of data are they trained to look out to the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Behnaz. It's really wonderful.
Hello, my name is Giovanna Pillaca. I'm a member of the DigitalFUTURES team after my experience in InclusiveFUTURES. And today, as manager of South America, I want to share with you a piece of video of how Tin Sang and Tin Jin Lee they try to define the experience of the play with objects and physical forces of the real world to virtual experiments. They define in short words the importance of the definition of the geometry and plans, but they understand that we can also define spaces in three-dimensional forms in appreciation of aesthetics and enriching ourselves with different perspectives of reality. The meaning of this divergent discourse allows me to free myself from the standards of learning architecture and resonate with the act of making architecture in confidence with my process. Thank you.
We're currently teaching undergrad studios and digital representation at the University of Hong Kong. The works we share today are some recent explorations around point clouds. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yep. So hi guys, I'm Tian Li. Today within only like 5 to 6 minutes, we're going to go through a lot of images and short videos. But first, let us briefly introduce ourselves. In our art and architectural practice, we're interested in a couple of things. We do material experiments, particularly of plastics and industrialized material with an elusive origin. And we are very fond of its pliability, texture, and color, and also the playful interaction between our body and the material. We also do photo collages, a special type of collage, taking each photo as a pixel to form the final image. So these are the final images. All of these are created not with just several photos, but actually with over 1,000 individual pictures. We also do renderings and try to use images to create an immersive visual narrative. And just like others, we make buildings and we design buildings, but perhaps again, with an emphasis on representation. And these days, we're also building with our students. But the journey today is about a very specific focus, which is point clouds. We did our first 3D scan using photogrammetry around 3 years ago. And we couldn't expect that actually this apple since then, ever since, actually accompanied us in the journey of searching for the medium specificity of point clouds.
Yeah. Thank you. So what we did was a bunch of prototypes to test ways to represent point clouds to understand its quote unquote materiality. So first we mapped the pixels onto paper and wrapped it around a chair. And you see on the lower left corner, the original apple is now duplicated as a low polygon paper apple, and it is just slightly bigger. So inspired by this low poly simulacra, we thought maybe we could turn the point cloud into some simple meshes and run it in 3D simulation and try to give it a different physical quality. So what if the apple is not solid, but instead it's inflated and start to bounce around? Or what if it is even softer and becomes floppy? We are exploring the uncanny different discrepancies between the apple's realistic texture and its weird physical performances. After having fun with mesh, we try to play with the cloud itself. The experiments here is to remap the points in the 3D space. In other words, we're not sculpting the apple, but distorting the space. And as the apple is moving in the distorted space, its projection or its map also changes in shape and texture. What we arrive at is this apple unrolling itself, refracted and reflected three-dimensionally, following a mathematically rigorous manner. And then we just wrote more mathematical functions, defining more field conditions, but still moving the same apple around. And then we had more. We simply want to see how many more mesmerizing GIFs can we actually create. So one heritage we got from the parametric age was this mesmerizing effect of those optimization animations. But here, without a very clear goal of optimizing anything, right? We simply appreciate the fact that it is always changing and looping. And as we create more prototypes, we also interrogate the same issue in a disciplinary view. What point cloud challenges is the idea of abstraction, a concept that is so essential to architecture. Conventionally, the complex reality is translated into simplified and precise geometric definition, and the further design operations take place on top of that abstraction. But with point cloud, a compilation of millions of points, how can we then alter it without reducing it to architectural line drawings again? In other words, what is point cloud's medium specificity? What is the supposed operation that best exploits its qualities?
And here we actually explored the different ways of mapping pixelated data onto 2D canvas. And they lead to different materialities of image, embodying different aesthetic experiences and shaping different perceptions of the same reality. So basically what you're looking at is a compilation of screenshots of Google satellite images of Manhattan. And the word materiality can take place in a rather literal way through operation on the level of texture, glossiness, or transparencies, and other material attributes. Can we create a surreal condition that challenges our imagination of reality? My answer, or our answer here, would be, of course. Materiality can be about taking a physical object and seeking for a new expression of it using different physical material. So it can be primarily in a physical realm. Materiality can also happen on the scale of time. Many of the objects in space we created were not really three-dimensional, but actually 4D. So, and their evolving qualities through time add up to their unfathomable depth. This object, for example, is a 3D scanned outer, mapped onto a revolving 4D cube. And it can be forever developing as time goes on. The aesthetic experience of looking at these images is very different from that of reading an architectural drawings, like line drawings, whatever drawings. What we are evoking here is not reading, but actually feeling. The word, like some architects may hate the most. And this is where we are at right now. To end here, we experiment with point cloud, explore and embrace its complexity. Without abstraction, actually, we altered the materiality. And hopefully that could inspire some of the new ways of designing, both in digital and in the physical world.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Hello, my name is Gustavo Rincon, and I am part of the Digital Futures World team. Today, I am very humbled and happy to share with you one of my inspirations over the years. It is a duo, an artistic duo, husband and wife, Haruji and Graham Wakefield. I met them over a decade ago at the Media Arts and Technology program, where we had classes together and we worked together with the Allosphere Research Group. Please enjoy the topics that we covered then are more relevant now: artificial life, generative algorithms, higher level mathematics, physics, philosophy, art, the history of media arts, cybernetics, architecture, and they inspired me to get to my topic, which is new media architectures. Please enjoy and share it with friends.
Dr. Haru G is a media artist and co-creator of a research project, Artificial Natures, exploring artificial life world making. She holds a PhD in the Media Arts and Technology from UCSD and is an assistant professor at DPXA and the Digital Futures programs at OCAD University at Toronto, Canada. Her work has been shown in art festivals, conferences, and venues, including SIGGRAPH, ICEA, EVO workshops, La Gaite Lyrique, ZKM, CAFA, Moxie, the Allosphere, Seoul City Hall, and recognized in the 2015 Vida Art and Artificial Life. Dr. Graham Wakefield is an artist researcher and a software developer, exploring the liveness of computation across the immersive media, and co-creator of Artificial Natures. As an associate professor in computational arts and Canada Research Chair in Computational Worldmaking, he directs the Alice Lab at York University. He holds a BA in philosophy from the University of Warwick, a Master's of Composition from Goldsmiths College, University of London, and a PhD in the Media Arts and Technology from UCSB. And he has written widely used media arts software such as Gen for Cycling 74 and Max. They will speak about artificial natures. Take it away, Graham and Haru.
Thank you for inviting us to these intriguing discussions and communities. We are very excited to for our future dialogues and collaborations. We began to form a media art group named Artificial Nature and have collaborated creating Artificial Natures since 2007.
Our approach to the theme of this panel, this new media architectures, begins from our non-hierarchical, non-presumptive, flat ontology between human, non-human, and man-made beings, as well as between virtual and physical realities. We also begin from a principle of what we call endogeny, in which lively change and value and creation come from the interrelations from within. And from here, several common attributes of our artificial natures follow. First, this is an interactive systems art, especially seeking for infinite feedback, such as we can find from any living ecosystem and the surroundings in nature. Second, we aim to realize shared realities, to bring non-human perspectives and to emphasize the overlapping surroundings between natural and artificial beings. And finally, we're working on non-mainstream approaches to creative artificial intelligence concerned with our wild and untamed future. And we'd like to flesh some of these ideas out by introducing a few of our works.
This is Time of Doubles, one of the artificial nature realizations in 2011 at the Seoul Olympic Museum of Art in South Korea. This installation realizes the coexistence of multiple doubles in mirrored worlds, in which organisms grow and adapt to an environment in part shaped by you, where your body influences currents of the wind while your virtual self is consumed by creatures. It is important to us that the complex network of feedback relations in the world surrounds the visitor in display and interaction. It brings the generative capacity of computation into an experiential level comparable to the open-endedness of the natural world. We use continuous and indirect modes of interaction where possible, preferring multimodal by directionality over symbolic cause and effect. So there's no beginning or end, no center or privileged position, but there remain continuous changes, processes, and organizations. Our next work, Endless Current, adapted to both immersive installations and VR experiences.
So the artificial life forms here subsist within a simulated 3D fluid environment that is constrained by an amorphous landscape reminiscent of underwater or microscopic spaces. And here we can illustrate our principle of endogeny through this dynamic complex network of feedback relations. So for example, the particles here aren't the surface kinds of effects that you would see in a video game. You can follow each one as it gains or loses structural energy or integrity, even follows it's being digested within an organism and then ejected out of it or by another species. So nothing here is static. Every element has got multiple influences with every other element. And it's really important to us that there's no dead ends, where meaning emerges from these interrelations rather than being semiotic symbols.
Next work is Archipelago. Here we focus on the use of mixed reality as a method of shared, playful, and open-ended complexity in hybrid space between human and non-human beings.
So its bestiary contains this pulsating lichen that sustains several species of moving organisms, displaying foraging, scavenging, predatory, and social behaviors like swarming, nesting, and pheromone trail marking. And as visitors reach down and touch the land, they can discover these alien creatures creeping onto their hands. And then they'll be able to lift these creatures up and carefully transport them to deposit into other regions or new islands that they've made, or to the destruction.
Your shadow destroys the vegetation underneath. You became a force of death, but also rebirth. The desolation is followed by greater fertility, but you are not a mighty god here. Interaction is nuanced in response, but your influence is limited.
Archipelago evolved to Inhabitat in 2017 at a Children's Science Museum and was visited by 65,000 visitors over 5 months. Its world awaits playful engagement through 3 distinct ways to see with other eyes. A macro-scale superpersonal perspective over the whole sculpture, a mesoscale view through the eyes of creature, and a micro-scale first-person perspective in virtual reality.
In 2018 summer, the island became many worlds of superposition. Here, again, we focused on plural views. Shared surroundings as umbrellas are experienced at different scales of space and time. We are bringing this possible alien world so that we can alienate ourselves first. In these alien worlds, can you become playful? Can artificial beings be curious and playful with us?
Our next work, Conservation of Shadows, focuses on shared realities with site specificity.
Salmachango is a recently acquired expansion of the Seoul Museum of Art within the former grounds of the Korea Center for Disease Control. Our work responds to this very specific history of the host venue through a central conception of shadows as shared physical images between visible and invisible worlds. A softly ringing motor actuated miniature bells surround the installation space, hanging down from the rafters at different locations and heights, varying in intensity and creating a variegated spatial sonic experience whenever invisible beings pass by. The shadows of these invisible beings mix with our own shadows on the silt bed underfoot.
By donning a head-mounted display, visitors take on an alternative perspective to witness a world coexisting in superposition. And what first appeared as flat shadows on the salt are unveiled to be alien creatures moving around and through our now shadowy bodies and responding to our movements and gestures. And you can also sense the shadow volumes of other people as they visit the space too. It's a little bit like the feeling of knowing someone's with you in a dark room. Oops.
Finally, our most recent work, InfraNet, brought new materials to our praxis. InfraNet combines real-world open data resources with evolutionary neural networks and extends the space of its complex adaptive system to the scale of a city. This work starts with the question, do we know what intelligence is? And if we don't know, how can we approach it? Our hypothesis to this was that intelligence is a phenomenon of cognition in general as an embedded condition for all living systems. Each exhibit of InfraNet utilizes public data available on the host city, including Gwangju, South Korea, Vancouver, Canada, and New York, USA.
None of the source data is itself directly displayed, and it's not being used to answer a question or answer a question. Rather, within this landscape of city data, thousands of artificial creatures are born, dwell, and die. And what we see are the traces and the trails that these creatures leave in space as they draw out their particular umbelts. Each one has an antenna to read and metabolize the underlying data, but these sensors are limited. They cannot read all channels, but rather have a personal taste or bias that filters most of the data out, as if for any particular creature, the majority of the data just doesn't exist. Each creature also has a unique neural network that is dynamic in both weights and architecture. They're excitable, they're sociable, they're curious. The creatures change their neural architectures every few chirps by mimicking those of their near neighbors. This is like the continuous genetic exchange of a bacterial quasi-species, or the contagious transfer of ideas. And as the creatures move, their society forms a much larger second-order neural network of ever-shifting structure, where ideas can move in pattern waves through the whole.
The color of trails and folks left behind represent their current taste, revealing the kinships. Thinner trails are more deeply ingrained than softer folks, a kind of long-term memory that gradually desaturates and then evaporates, revealing how creatures have discovered the city.
This is not evolution under some intense selective pressure, because we're not solving a pre-given problem, and because pressure can choke creativity. Their only condition of survival is a measure of well-being as expressed by two intrinsic motivations: to find data and to find trails. That is, a primal need to verify that the world exists and to know that one is not alone in it. Rather, there's a drive towards diversity. Creatures with lower well-being are more likely to mimic the neural networks of their neighbors, especially if their neighbor's taste is different.
Creature perceptions are also like neural spike trains and attempt to synchronize with their nearest neighbors, like flashing fireflies. Since the spikes make them move, the neighborhood changes and the perceptions never stabilize. Instead, linear, circular, and spiral waves can be seen in the population.
More recently, we found that there's a remarkable synergy between this kind of system and some models of non-conscious cognition in biological brains.
Here is a secondary visualization of watchers. Each watcher follows a creature as it moves through the data, displaying data about the creature's current state and dissimilarity to their neighbors. The watcher is a seeker of difference, a bio-CCTV. The original intention of the watcher system was as a regulator or immune response mechanism to subvert stagnant monocultures. However, once simulations started to run, we did not observe stagnation or over-centralization. The inhabitants appear to create ever-changing patterns without converging. This is an example of working with machines for collective creativity beyond our expectations, revealing what we didn't know, we think.
A slide. AI and new media are smearing to all aspects of life, into what Catherine Hales has described as planetary cognitive ecology. And we're cautious about static performance measures and assumptions, such as used by supervised AIs, that can only predict what is already known. We're cautious of the risk in working with the low-hanging fruit of available data, the readily measurable properties, the known structures, etc., as exploiting too soon, and thus over-determining available paths of action and limiting futures. We don't want to live in a future that's already paid by the past. Instead, we see creativity as oriented to an open future, producing new qualities through intrinsic motivations while enlightening the unknown.
Again, thinking of planetary cognitive ecology, this points away from optimization toward anti-fragility. Almost all the Earth's biomass is now in service to humans. We have reduced the wild unknown to pockets and islands. Directly or indirectly, we displace anything we can't measure or make use of. even without knowing what it might be. Despite the fact that optimization leads to vulnerability, we hope that a better understanding of creativity and complex variety beyond the human-centric may point again to qualities of the wild. Perhaps living with the artificial natures can bring us to the wild too.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Dear friends and colleagues around the world, Assalamu alaikum. My greetings from Cairo, Egypt. تحياتي الطيبة لكم جميعا من أرض الكنانة مصر. I am Ahmed Hasab, a PhD candidate in building technology, specialized in digital fabrication, teaching at the American University in Cairo, alongside working as a senior architect at Engineering Consultants Group. أنا مهندس معماري وطالب دكتوراه في مجال تكنولوجيا البناء وخاصة التصنيع الرقمي، وبدرس في الجامعة الأمريكية بالقاهرة بجانب عملي في جماعة المهندسين الاستشاريين as a senior architect. I'm a committee member at Digital Futures World and Africa Regional Manager. Joined them 2 years ago. عضوا بفريق Digital Futures World من سنتين ومدير إقليمي لأفريقيا. I did choose this clip because I believe the world is vast and our perception is limited to our physical capabilities. As example, we can hear limited domain from the sound waves, not all of them. And based on our physical capabilities, we see the world. لقد اخترت هذا الفيديو، أو بالمصري أنا اخترت الفيديو ده إن العالم عظيم وكبير وإمكانياتنا الفيزيائية المحدودة بتأثر على الإدراك. كمثال إحنا بنسمع جزء محدد من موجات الصوت من الترددات بتاعتها، مش كل الترددات. And what is amazing in the last 2 years and what we united to do at Digital Futures is to bring these different views and domains for you to build on and work on for a better future for everyone. والرائع خلال السنتين اللي فاتوا إن إحنا اجتمعنا في Digital Future عشان نجيب وجهات النظر المختلفة دي ليك أنت تبني عليهم وتتعلم منهم وتشتغل لمستقبل أفضل للجميع. My greetings for you all, dear heroes. تحياتي الطيبة لكم جميعا.
Hi, my name's Memo Akten. I'm a computational artist, and my biggest inspiration is studying the nature of nature. This spans from the nuclear fusion in the heart of the sun to the photosynthesizing organisms that fuel all of life on the surface of the earth, to the incredibly complex hyperobject that we call human civilization and culture. I use computational approaches as a lens and language to abstract the behavior of these natural and anthropogenic processes to create data dramatizations. My research centers around expressive human-machine interaction and interventions that encourage meaningful human control, a term that I appropriate from the autonomous weapons literature. Framing technology as not external to us, but as extensions of our body, as extensions of our mind, I study its impact on us as individuals, on how we behave and how we express ourselves. And as cogs in a much larger machine, its broader impact on the complex networks that we form, on culture, and ultimately on our values, our laws, traditions, and rituals. As part of studying the nature of nature, I'm also very interested in studying the nature of the mind and how we make sense of the world. I am 70 trillion separate cells, more than half of which are not even human, and yet they all work together such that their interactions gives rise to the sensation that I have this one single unified body with a single unified sense of I, coordinated by the brain, an incredibly complex non-linear dynamical system in a constant state of oscillation, while its internal balance is continually perturbed. It's constantly seeking equilibrium, making predictions, and resulting in what we call perceiving, thinking, and feeling. The image that we see in our conscious mind is not a mirror image reflection of the outside world, but it is a reconstruction, a hallucination, based on our expectations and prior beliefs. So in my work, I create data dramatizations of natural and anthropogenic processes, and I explore state-of-the-art machine learning algorithms as a means to reflect on ourselves and how we make sense of the world. I know everyone hates Deep Dream, but I really love it. But it's not the aesthetics that I love, but the poetry of what's happening inside the algorithm. An artificial neural network has been trained to recognize objects in images, and now it's presented a new image that it doesn't recognize, such as my face. And what the Deep Dream algorithm does is, it runs the network backwards to generate new images, such that it amplifies certain neural activation patterns deep in the depths of the neural network. So this is analogous to you looking at a cloud and thinking that you see a rabbit, and then you draw the rabbit that you think you see, and then you look at the rabbit that you just drew, and then you draw again what you think you saw. So that in itself is interesting, metaphorically speaking. But I think this is far more interesting than that, because people look at these images and they say, oh look, it's a puppy slug or a bird lizard. But actually, there's no such thing as a puppy slug or a bird lizard. What we're seeing here is just noise with a particular distribution, such that when you look at it, you can't help but project what you know onto it. There are certain patterns in the original image which cause corresponding neurons in the artificial neural network to fire weakly, and then the Deep Dream algorithm amplifies those features in the original image. And then when we look at these images, activity in our brain registers those exact same features which were amplified by the Deep Dream algorithm, whether it be puppy-like or slug-like features. And we complete that recognition process by projecting those meanings back onto the image. This is like an entanglement. It's a duet of a quest for meaning making between an artificial and a biological neural network. And this is what a lot of my work around AI is exploring, using machines that learn to reflect on how we make sense of the world, and using machine bias to reflect on our own self-affirming cognitive biases. Because you can put this into an artificial neural network, pure random white noise, and it goes on a long journey through multiple dimensions and transformations in space and time, because quite literally that is what a deep neural network is, to produce this, a more structured noise with a more particular distribution. And we are machines that yearn structure. It's who we are and what we've always done. We look for patterns and we find them, and we project what we know onto them. We invent stories and we believe them. It's how we deal with uncertainty and how we connect with each other. We invent rituals, algorithms for the body and mind to transform our mental and emotional state to otherwise unattainable modes of being. We see things not as they are, but as we are. It depends on who we are, where we've been, and what we've done. Everything that you see, or read, or hear, even these sentences that I'm saying right now, you're trying to make sense of by relating to your own past experiences, filtered by your prior beliefs and knowledge. And actually, I have no idea what any of what I'm saying means to any of you. It's impossible for me to see the world through your eyes and feel what you feel without having read everything you've read, seen everything you've seen, and lived everything you've lived. Empathy and compassion is harder than we might think, and that makes it all the more valuable and crucial. This is from a series of work called Learning to See. It's an artificial neural network running real-time inference on live camera input. And there's a few themes behind this work. On a practical level, it's exploring expressive human-machine interaction, investigating deep learning to develop systems that augment human creative expression. Specifically, generative systems that we can use in a real-time, expressive manner with continuous, meaningful human control. As well as a number of videos, the work also exists as an installation. There's a plinth with a bunch of junk on it, some broken cables and dirty rags, and you can spend a few seconds playing with them for a quick bit of fun, or, if you're like me, you can spend hours meticulously crafting your perfect bouquet, or shaping your perfect waves or ocean scene. The models I trained are inspired by the 4 elements of nature. Flowers represent earth, the ocean is water of course, there's fire, clouds represent air or wind, and the 5th element, beyond our planet, the ether, the void, the cosmos, the home of God. This neural network is trained on thousands of images from the Hubble Space Telescope. But there are high-level motivations. This is a network which has seen nothing but thousands of images of waves or flowers. And now it looks upon the world and sees my desk and my hands, and it tries to make sense of what it's seeing in context of what it's seen before. But it can see only through the filter of what it already knows. Just like us, because we too see things not as they are, but as we are. We might be tempted to think that this network has learnt what distant space looks like, but of course that's not entirely accurate. The Hubble Space Telescope doesn't give us these perfect snapshot photographs as objective visual representations of outer space. Rather, it streams data, numbers, and then those numbers are interpreted by us humans, by engineers, by scientists, even by artists, who stitch together patches and composite layers and even add colors. We don't know what distant space actually looks like. I don't even know if it's a valid question to ask if we can imagine what it looks like, if we can even fathom those kinds of scales, hundreds of thousands of light years in diameter. So this neural network isn't learning what space looks like, it's learning what we think space should look like, tainted with our assumptions, our biases, our romantic visions. And speaking of romantic visions, there is another motivation behind this particular work, because as I alluded to at the start of this presentation, I enjoy being reminded quite often that the atoms in my body, and in yours, and in fact everything that we see around us, were forged in the dying hearts of stars and supernova billions of years ago, billions of light years away, and was spewed across the galaxies before they came together for a very brief moment in time to become you and me. And as I quoted before, we are all connected. The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself.
This is a world of wonders.
Salam به همه. Hello, I'm Mohammed Behjo. I'm Iran's regional manager at Digital Futures World, and I'm also the founder and director of Digital Futures for C. My selection is Digital Consortium lecture, performance-based digital design methodologies. When I was doing my master's degree at the University of Tehran, my classmates and I talked about the adverse effects on the environment and the damaging effects of what we as designers design and build. We discussed how to mitigate these adverse effects. This session can raise awareness of the destructive impacts of AEC on the environment and how we can tackle these issues. Architects and designers must change the way they design and build buildings and structures. This approach to design urges designers to find more sustainable resources of material and energy. We can change the way we think, design, and build. Thank you.
I try to sneak in as many updates as possible because I'm also, of course, aware that this is not the first time that I present here. So I hope that you will learn some new things or get some updates on some of our projects indeed. So I titled my lecture Sustainable Digital Concrete Construction. I do this on purpose to maybe immediately set the tone about, for me, the target is sustainability. The way that we achieve it is through computation. And a material that we are exploring currently is concrete, which is being labeled as the most destructive material on the planet. And so I hope that through my presentation, you will see that my title is not just a provocation, it's also not kind of a weird or confusing or misleading statement, but that hopefully through going through the process, how we actually approach structures, that you will see that even a material like concrete, when used appropriately, indeed can be quite disruptive and even challenge many other materials when it comes to environmental targets and so on. So with that, I think I already set the stage right. I also hope that I am preaching to the choir by showing a slide like this. I nonetheless still present it because I believe this should be driving much of what we do in the fields of architecture, engineering, fabrication, construction, because on a global level, and of course these are rounded up numbers, it's some estimations say 36%, other 39%. It depends also which target that you're looking at. But this is easy to remember. As an industry, and I'm talking about building, construction, operation of buildings, and so on. So everything that has to do with our business, on a global level, we are responsible to 40% of the impact, which is something that I think we need to absolutely take serious. So 40% of the global greenhouse gas, man-made greenhouse gas emissions come from construction and buildings. 40% of resource consumption, and what's of course problematic is that this is referring to virgin materials, so for first-time resources. 40% of global waste production, again, this is mind-boggling that this is happening. And then also this you might have heard for sure, that a lot of energy is being used both in the production but also in the operation of buildings indeed. Again, apologies if all of this is known to you and if I'm repeating myself, but if we were to build like we build today, in order to provide an average quality of living to all these people, these 20% more people that are expected to be on this planet in the next 20, 30 years, then this is what it translates to. The challenge that we have ahead of us is we need to build the equivalent of one New York City every month for the next 40 years. So we shouldn't do this as we do it now because these gigantic global numbers still this that argues this. This is probably something, this framing was very similar in other lectures, but I want to just emphasize that those are indeed the two aspects that I believe we need to fundamentally disrupt and find other solutions for. We need to design, we need to build differently. As a half architect, half structural engineer, I would call myself a structural designer or an architectural designer, an architectural engineer, that is. I will be focusing mainly on the embodied emissions, so the ones that are related to production of materials, construction, and so on, and less the operational energy. But just a quick statement there, theoretically, the world would have a very straightforward solution to reduce the operational energy and emissions very directly by actually switching to renewable, greener sources, green sources of energy. But we don't have an as straightforward solution to a problematic embodied emissions. I like to adopt or borrow this equation by Catherine de Wolf, which she developed for her PhD with John Oxendorf at MIT, where she really brings or reduces the complexity to what really matters. The global warming potential, which is a bad thing. So it's basically the amount of pollution associated with a building, a construction, can be just the sum of all the part of this building. And then there's two things that are important. What she calls the structural material quantities. So basically the volume of material that one uses. And then the second is this ECC, which is the embodied carbon coefficient. These are basically coefficients that describe or that capture the pollution associated to a material. So you see in this equation that actually our target should be very simple. You can either make a structure, so reduce the volume significantly, a structure very light, or you can use very low impact, so low pollution materials. Ideally, of course, you achieve the two. But so maybe an important point to make here is that in engineering history, the last decades, engineers have been mainly focusing on always lighter, lighter, lighter is better. But this is not necessarily true, right? Because if you make it lighter, but then in exchange, you use a highly, highly polluting material, so a material with a high embodied carbon coefficient, like carbon fiber, for example, then you might be offsetting many of the things that you're trying to achieve by going lighter. So what I will show in this lecture is I will talk about strength through geometry. I will explicitly also talk about material effectiveness. Again, I already made this comment just now. It's not just about efficiency in the traditional way of defining it, so in being less material, lighter, but it's more about how you use material. So this is key. And then, of course, as I already said all the way in the beginning, we use computation both for the design and fabrication to try to design and build indeed differently. So right now, we are about 12 years into our adventure. So I started my chair in August 2009, and we have tried to not just remain theoretical, not just stick to the design on the design side, but also then question how we build things. And now increasingly, we're trying to translate these ideas in real projects, which really is a totally different kind of challenge. And I will give some insights on this later on as well. Let's first.
Now it's time to think about our resources. Be responsible with other lives. Value ecological diversity, nature, and also learn from the indigenous communities of our region, their natural medicines, their memories, their techniques, in order to develop new technologies that can develop in balance with our ecological environments in the South American territory. Valuing the intelligence with which our ancestors adapted, Ana Maria Duran Calisto opens our eyes to see our territories and inhabitants with the cultural diversity that characterizes it. Ahora en español. Ahora es tiempo de pensar en nuestros recursos, ser responsables con otras vidas, valorar la diversidad ecológica, la naturaleza y también de aprender de las comunidades indígenas de nuestra región, sus medicinas naturales, sus memorias, sus técnicas, para poder desarrollar nuevas tecnologías que puedan desarrollarse en equilibrio con nuestros entornos ecológicos en el territorio sudamericano. Valorando la inteligencia con la que nuestros ancestros se adaptaron, Ana María Duran Calisto nos abre los ojos para ver nuestros territorios y habitantes con la diversidad cultural que la caracteriza.
Okay, so it's hard to discuss Amazonia in 15 to 20 minutes, but I'll try to be as concise as possible as we address a ginormous biome. And I would like to emphasize the notion of habitat design as we discuss Amazonia at different scales, from the scale of the beautiful details that Andrea shared with us to the scale that, for example, Gabriel presented to us, which is continental. And just so that you get a sense of the scale of Amazonia, this National Geographic image, I really liked it because besides showing the extent of the fires, which was a continental in scale, it also shows the scale of the biome in relationship to continental US. And look at the overlap. It's about between 80 and 85%. So imagine the United States, the continental portion of the United States covered with a rainforest. That is Amazonia. And you also wonder when you look at this overlap, if this forest, where in the US would it be standing? And that's the question that I would like to pose today to the global north. And the diversity, as Gustavo already mentioned, is ginormous, not just ecologically. We tend to view Amazonia as some sort of an homogeneous jungle, but the diversity ecologically is ginormous and culturally as well. Both completely overlap. More than 350 languages are spoken today in Amazonia. Many have already disappeared. Not only biology is being extinguished at an insane pace, but also languages and cultures. And I love this map because it only shows South America, unfortunately, and it only shows 6 languages. But you can see the extent of the dispersion of each one of them, Ge, Caribe, Arawak, Pano, Tucano, and Tupi, and where they're spoken. And if you could expand this map to the north, you would see that some languages that belong to the nationalities, the original nationalities of the Americas, which indigenous peoples are calling Abiyala, to decolonize language, are Pan-American and go all the way from southern Canada to the Paraná. So what we see in the pre-Columbian period is an incredibly mobile Pan-American networked society. And this map starts to discuss at the continental scale the level of dispersion, the level of movement of these cultures. And that's important to keep in mind because Amazonia has been a cradle, a cultural cradle, and I would say even civilizational cradle in the Americas. And that's exactly the opposite of what we think of when we think about Amazonia. Why? Because Amazonia, unfortunately, is shrouded in myth. And when I say shrouded in myth, I'm referring to very specific and very recent myths, actually. One of them we have inherited from the Enlightenment, and it is the myth of the noble savage, which I would like to put on the table because Amazonia has no savages and no noble savages for sure. It has human beings. And the other myth is the myth, this is a romantic, and this tension between Enlightenment and Romanticism, I love it because both have created myths that have actually harmed Amazonia. The Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was all about naturalists coming to the tropics, to study them, but with a very colonial purpose of doing tropical resource surveys so that, they could serve in a way commerce and other geographies. And then the counterpart, Romanticism, created this myth of the pristine nature, which has also been detrimental to the original nations of the Americas, because there were one more layer of dispossession. This book is amazing. It speaks about the Indian removal and the making of the national parks, because in North America, even conservation, environmentalism, and conservation movements have contributed to this dispossession, because you had to have the romantic, humanless, pristine wilderness. So all the tribes that had lived there for centuries, thousands of years maybe, were removed in order to make the geography match the romantic image that was expected from it. And at the core of it all, since 1492, is the concept of terra nullius, tierra de nadie, we say in Spanish, no man's land. And of course, areas that were being colonized by Europe were conceptualized legally through this doctrine in order to make them appropriable to the dispossession of course, Native Americans, which I know it's a complicated term, Native American, indigenous. I want to acknowledge that. And even now, you know, already you were telling us, Gabriel, about the Biennale on coexistence, and it was very interesting to see that Aravena, where Elemental has dedicated its efforts to the Mapuche in Chile. So it seems that there's a reckoning throughout the Americas, from Canada to the Patagonia, with the fact that we have built our colonial system upon the dispossession of Native Americans, which up to this day is the source of immense conflict, because access to the land and the notion of property of the land is at the core of contestation up to this day. And right now in the Amazon, I think Gustavo showed that beautifully, that is definitely an incredible source of conflict, the overlapping property regimes in Amazonia. And you also have, on the other hand, of course, resistance, and how we can use the same legal systems to precisely vindicate native lands, just as we can use digital technologies to vindicate rights in Amazonia. But the issue with the pristine myth is that it creates an image of Amazonia that is literally the alter ego, the complete antonym of urbanization. So we imagine Amazonia as this like cityless forest. And that has nothing to do with the fact, which is that Amazonia is actually a highly urbanized area. Most people in Amazonia live in cities. Berta Becker was the first one to describe Amazonia as an urbe amazonida, as an urban forest. Foresta urbana, I think it is in Portuguese, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't speak Portuguese, unfortunately. But this foresta urbana is not just the result of the last urbanization that has been triggered by extractivism. It has been a foresta urbana for thousands of years. And when you study the palimpsest, the urban palimpsest of Amazonia, you realize that the ancestral constellation of urbanism in Amazonia is actually the foundation of the urbanization that we see until this day. But what did change that, even though some nodes are common in these networks, is the introduction of the highway. In terms of digital technologies, the ones that I'm going to focus on are satellites, because I think that satellites have played that double role. On the one hand, of perpetuating the Enlightenment tradition of surveying resources with ever more powerful mechanisms to appropriate them. But on the other hand, just like cartography, satellites are also serving resistance, and they are also serving to unveil a memory and a history that is telling an incredibly interesting story that I think will empower the nationalities of our ancestral populations. But satellite technologies have become incredibly powerful. They used to be these, like one eye looking at the earth. When you look at the Landsat images of the past, when you start looking at satellite images, you see that, you find one image that's looking at one place in one particular moment in time. But what we're experiencing today is that you can access, the webpage of Planet and download images at an incredibly high resolution that literally cover the whole surface of the Earth in real time at every single moment, because we have a polycentric system of microsatellites that populate the atmosphere to look at the planet from very many perspectives at the same time. And you can compose an image of the whole planet every second of the day. These, in Foucauldian terms of power and vision, is pretty disturbing, but at the same time, it has huge potential. Now, on the one hand, we've used this power to do this, to survey resources, survey them on the ground as well. We're using digital technologies, obviously, to find them, but also on the ground technologies to specifically locate them. And these, for example, are oil patterns in the coast of Venezuela, which show a grid and a puncturing of the land as oil is explored. These technologies obviously were transferred to South America from North America. And in the Amazon, it acquires a linear pattern precisely because there's a forest. So you penetrate the Amazon by air when there's no highway. And, first in small airplanes that allow you to land, then you can build a strip and then you can access it with larger airplanes, and then you just build a highway and the pipeline to take the oil out to an Atlantic or a Pacific port. But the pattern is linear and the punctuation is transversal. And the transformation that has been generated in Amazonia through the prospection and extraction of oil is immense. And the issue that we have there is that Amazonia is like a ginormous sponge. It's like a huge swamp. It's an incredibly liquid, dynamic space in which soil and water cannot be separated in the least. So leakages of oil are a huge problem, and they generate immense contamination. And the way in which we establish the operations of oil in Amazonia is incredibly irresponsible from an environmental standpoint. Because, for example, Texaco, they found oil in 1967, 68 in northeastern Ecuador. Ecuador, my country, has only 2% of Amazonia, of Pan-Amazonia. Brazil obviously controls about 65%, and 8 other nations, the rest, 8 in total, I mean. But in Ecuador, it's just a very small patch. That small patch, nevertheless, is more than 50% of our territory. So Amazonia in Ecuador is extremely important. And what has happened there is very upsetting and disturbing, and has obviously marked our culture in deep ways. And it has obviously marked my, influence profoundly my work and the way I approach architecture and the territory. But you can see that areas that were like these and that were being surveyed by plane back in the 50s and 60s are now like these externalities. Urbanization is a negative externality of urbanization elsewhere, of planetary urbanization, so to speak, because it's some sort of an unintended byproduct that is creating the favelization of Amazonia. 80% of urbanization in Amazonia is informal in nature. And generally, there's planning, of course. There's planning in the sense that there's the planning of extraction, of prospection, and there's the planning of infrastructure, mobility infrastructures. And that's the genesis of the urbanization, but there's not much planning when it comes to actually thinking these spaces that are going to mushroom and burgeon in the forest. And of course, the environmental side effects are incredibly destructive. These images are from Judith Kimmerling, who wrote a book called Amazon Crude. Judith has a very interesting story. She's an environmental lawyer and a human rights lawyer who lives in New York. And she was reading, the paper one day in New York and read that the oil companies were saying that in Ecuador, it's not their fault that there's, environmental destruction, because the destruction is coming from the colonization of the highway, which is, a byproduct of the infrastructural construction of extraction, but that they're not contaminating the forest. And Judith thought that was very strange, because she was a lawyer for the fishermen in the Bay here in New York.
as my final nomination, I'd like to nominate the speech given, the thank you speech given on receipt of the Mark Cousins Memorial Theory Award, the speech given by Aleksandra Jaeschke. Her work is exquisite, her thinking is really very beautiful, and she addresses a really important kind of question about environmental sustainability. What was so nice about this particular award is that Aleksandra herself had been a student under Mark Cousins at the Architectural Association.
First of all, I've said that before to you, Neil. You know, I'll have to do a lot of really thoughtful thinking and writing to deserve a prize given in Mark Cousins' name. His Friday lecture set the rhythm of the days that I spent at the AA as a student, as you mentioned. And I do think that there are really many, many theorists out there who deserve this prize more than I do. But of course, I truly appreciate this recognition. And I take it as an encouragement. So Neil, Philippe, and everyone else at DigitalFUTURES, thank you. And Sanford, I did not know you chaired the jury. Thank you very much. Now, if there is a couple of minutes, I can say a couple of words.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So, you know, I asked myself when I started in this period writing and found out about this recognition, what does it mean to be a theorist? I have been really reluctant to accept this label because I see myself as an architect who, to some degree, disappointed by by the profession, has taken a break from design to search for another way to practice. But also, since I now teach, to help students of architecture to push the boundaries of how they will one day do it. And so I started to be more comfortable with the idea of contributing in theoretical ways only when a friend suggested that theory meant providing frameworks, that to some degree emancipating oneself, as he put it, requires a conceptual map. And I thought, okay, so to untether yourself from the common ways of thinking and hence doing, you need a set of principles, a procedural almost protocol, a map. And I started to think of theory as a form of map making, which made me feel much more comfortable. Now, you don't need a map if you actually go places that are already known to you, the ones commonly visited by your peers. But if you feel that pushing the boundaries, and I don't mean it in a way that a fashion-obsessed provocateur might mean it, I mean it in terms of ecological and ethical boundaries. If your gut is telling you that pushing those boundaries is necessary, then you need a map. Now, you can take a stick or a paddle, or as Sanford Quinter would put it, a machete, and plow your way through whichever uncharted territory you decide to explore. But the path will disappear as quickly as you've made it if you don't make a map of it. Not only you might get lost, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the journey will isolate you from your community if you don't somehow share the gained insight with your peers, which is exactly what you're doing now. Perhaps this is a way in which one can think about theory so that it's adventurous, it's dynamic, but it's also collaborative and embedded in the biophysical and intellectual environment. Now, to my mind, a fascinating aspect of every theoretical investigation worthy of the name is that it actually combines venturing into the unknown, this kind of speculating straight from your gut, as I like to think about it, and at the same time, attaching yourself to the webs woven by other minds. That is especially fascinating, of course, when the minds that is your mind, my mind, and the other minds are co-fabulating in a synchronized way that is more or less at the same time as we're doing in this fascinating period, all in part thanks to you because of the platform you created, but also recently thanks to Cynthia Davison and her logarithms. But there is also an act of reviving the energy of the mind set in type, so to speak, the minds that you find in books. Now, when I did my PhD, or my doctoral dissertation, I should say precisely, the initial criticism was that I was venturing way too far into an old growth forest of forgotten thoughts and events and minds. I insisted that this was the only way to do it, with the risk of failing, wasting thousands of borrowed dollars, not to mention not getting a Harvard diploma, but I knew of no other way to undo the dogmatic ideas about sustainability, green architecture, and energy efficiency than getting out there into that forgotten world of past minds to ask them. I know some will say, just go and participate, practice. It was not my way. Now, I needed to think. Now, I had my intuitions, but I also trusted a couple of incredibly creative minds that are active in this period. And of course, I was fortunate enough to know personally and have him as my professor, Sanford Quinter, who I simply trusted, and I trusted the hints that were offered to me to start the journey, and of course, other minds as well. Every single lead from those minds was precious. I know that these leads, I knew they would somehow spread like a rhizomatic root system, and they did. So I drew a map for myself, a map that I keep on redrawing to make sure I don't fall back into the commonly spread ways of thinking about sustainability and the environment. I want to emphasize briefly another issue, that I think creating theoretical frameworks or maps is not a purely intellectual or cognitive process that can be somehow, that can happen in vitro in an isolated brain or inside a computer. It's about activating your perceptive and emotional capacities, but it's also about that gut intelligence and spirituality as well. And the map must be at least three-dimensional: intellectual, spiritual, and ecological, if not simply biophysical, which in itself has many dimensions. I, for example, do a lot of thinking when I walk. Somehow the act of walking in the environment, not in front of the computer, triggers a particular type of creative, although crude, thinking that I'm raw thinking that I'm convinced is only possible due to the constant coupling of the brain and body within the environment. The dimensions of the thinking process, they need to keep on, they expand if you think about it. If you consider also the fact that ecology in itself and interrelatedness must consider energetic, material, and informational processes to be complete. So thinking about these processes on another level also requires involvement of the bodies, minds, and spirituality. And I think this is where the last component, something that is really hard for us to deal with, is where our ancestral or indigenous knowledge comes in as a helpful map that we should be trying to retrieve from our collective memory. And I think that intellectual activity is normally considered something that we do in a controlled, aware way. You need to know where you're going or what you are looking for to make a map. But I think to add another dimension to it, there's another way, and that will take me to Mark Cousins. You need to know, it's almost like drifting with others, surfing along other minds. It's meditating on the map-making process that other thinkers offer to you when they decide to publicly share their journeys in speech or writing. And by the way, of course, those acts are also creative acts. They are not just representation of something done earlier. Now, how do you meditate on a lecture, for example? I think you simply allow it to affect you on other than intellectual levels in ways that you might not even understand, but might sense as forms of vibrations. And to me, Mark Cousins' lectures did that. I did not always, if ever, understand them at that time, but they worked at that deep level. They taught me that testing ideas and articulating thoughts was a way to diagram potential directions. It was a way to question the boundaries of our discipline, even if we did not know as students where these boundaries were. Now, what are the minds that we should be co-theorizing with? For me, in this period, it's scientists, spiritual leaders that I look to for leads. And I think architects really need voices from the outside of our discipline. Otherwise, our discipline will simply atrophy. Neil and Philippe, thank you for creating this platform and for seeing, Neil especially, for seeing potential in my research in intellectual map making. I want to thank Sanford for allowing me to tap into some of his mental maps. And I would really like to thank Victoria Barber, who involved me in the first conversations on this platform. Victoria, I think you deserve this prize much more than me. I have become a kindred spirit and, well, Victoria has become my kindred spirit, a kindred mind. And to Mark, I hope that you're smiling, or at least not frowning. Your Friday lectures were like a mantra to a young meditator, trusting that not understanding does not mean not learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for our review of 2021. We look forward to a very special week in Digital Futures. On Tuesday, the 14th of December, we have our first ever session in Arabic, followed by our first ever session in Farsi on Friday, the 17th. Then we have our final English session in English on the 18th of December, Saturday, the 18th of December. We will take a break on Christmas Day itself and on New Year's Day, and we will start again on the 8th of January. Thank you to those who helped put this session together. Thank you to our team. Thank you to all of those who contributed in 2021, to those the workshop instructors, and to those who were part of the sessions. And thank you to you for viewing us. Come and join us again in 2022, where we hope to have an even more special year than what has been this year. 2021 has been a fantastic year. See you again in 2022. Thank you.